Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to Large Scale Scrum of New York and global, having grown past the 5,000 people mark just recently. Today we have a very special guest, and this is not the first time when this person is speaking to our very large and keeping to grow community. Bjarte Bogsnes. He probably does not need any introduction at this point, just because he has done so much work also facing our community. But I will just share a few very, very important points, bullets about his career that really matter here. He is a true expert and internationally recognized name in the world of finance, HR, and budgeting. So finance, budgeting, and HR, specifically within organizations that have taken a real, a true path towards ecosystemic organizational agility and adaptiveness. But Bjarte has written a number of books on the subject and has gone through multiple steps in his career where he really learned the firsthand what it means to apply adaptive budgeting, agile budgeting to organizations, really looking into organizational ecosystemic agility, including business agility, product management, and other organizational dimensions. So without any further ado, I would like to pass the baton over to Bjarte. He will manage the floor, the podium, and the time as he prefers. And if you have any questions, feel free to ping them in the chat room. I'll try to do my best to monitor, or raise your hand and we will see you asking, and Bjarte will pick them up when he feels it's most appropriate, right? And we will try to decommission a few minutes before, we will try to dismiss a few minutes before the hour so everyone can make it back to their daily working routine, okay? And I will be sharing also some assets in the chat as well. Thank you very much, Bjarte. The floor is yours. Please take it away.
Thank you, Gene, and thank you for the invitation. And hello, everybody. I used to work for a company called Equinor, earlier called Statoil, which actually one of Scandinavia's largest companies, which implemented beyond budgeting back in 2005. I made a difficult decision last year. I left the company to be able to work full-time with beyond budgeting through Bogsnes advisory, because there is a massive demand out there. So I'm busier than ever and having more fun than ever. So, agile transformation and the elephant in the room. Let me give some meat on the bone on this headline right away. What I'm going to say now is no criticism of Agile. I'm a big fan of Agile. But I think one of the reasons for the initial success of what I would call early Agile has to do with its birthplace, which is in software development and how teams work. And I think what executives in big companies observed in those early years were faster, better projects, more engaged and happy employees and so on. And who can be against that, right? I love Agile. Keep up the good work. But then Agile started to scale and a few things happened. First of all, Agile started to have consequences for executives and their beliefs and behaviors. And then it wasn't that fun anymore. And also this scaling happened using the same language that worked so well in those early days. But for an executive unfamiliar with Agile or with rugby for that sake, Scrum might sound like a skin disease, or Slack might sound like laziness, or a sprint might sound like running faster and continuous delivery about 24/7. So, in order to scale Agile, we need a language that executives can understand and relate to. And Beyond Budgeting is offering that language. The third thing that happened was that Again, Agile was not designed originally as a way to run an organization. So when you scale Agile, these holes in Agile becomes visible. And these are the holes that Beyond Budgeting, as we will find out, is filling, because Beyond Budgeting was designed, intended from day one as a way of running an enterprise in an Agile way. So we never talk about scaling Beyond Budgeting because it was scaled from day one. So that was a bit more on that headline for today, and I will make all of this more tangible as we know move on. And every time I talk about Beyond Budgeting with people, discuss it with people, especially executives, finance people, there is one word that keeps coming up over and over again, and that word is control. And the context is, of course, the fear of losing control. So I tend to ask these people, what do you mean with control? What are you so afraid of losing? And after people have said cost control, many go quiet. They actually struggle with defining what they are so afraid of losing, which is quite interesting. So I checked up Oxford Dictionary. How do they define control? And they call it the power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events. And what does this mean in organizational terms, in business terms? Well, it basically means controlling people and controlling the future. And behind these two lies the two main assumptions behind traditional management. Number one, that you can't trust people. And number two, that the future is predictable and plannable. And as you all know, this is not true. And this is what we are challenging in Beyond Budgeting, because these are simply illusions of control. For instance, that key people can and must be managed, and that the future is predictable and plannable and manageable. Wise people out there have definitely agreed with what I just have said, talking about people. There was a guy called Peter Drucker that you will know that guy, and I have a very nice quote from him coming up in a minute. But one reflection on trusting people or not trusting people. I've always traveled a lot, and traveling is now coming back after the pandemic. And the first thing I always check when I enter the hotel room is what kind of clothing hangers do they have? And as you all know, one of these are the ones that we typically get or that the hotel offer us. And I guess we can all agree that the one at the bottom is a hassle to use compared to the hanger with a hook, right? So how come hotels, or at least some hotels, offer us these stupid clothing hangers? Well, I think we know why. It's all about those few hotel guests that stole one or two of those hangers with a hook. And what was the response? To punish everybody because somebody did something wrong. Put everybody in jail because somebody did something wrong. Actually, one of the problems with traditional management, which I will come back to. But our good friend Peter Drucker, most of what we call management is about making it difficult for people to do their job. And I couldn't agree more. Sometimes the problem is that we manage too much. And talking about planning, another wise person, Russell Acuff, he compared a lot of the corporate planning he was observing in especially large organizations. He compared it with a ritual rain dance. It has no effect on the weather, but those who engage in it think it does. And I can relate to what Mr. Acuff was saying here, because I have done a lot of dancing in my life. My first management job, after I graduated from business studies in the early 80s at the company called Statoil, now Equinor, my first management job, head of the corporate budget department. So I've been heading up more budget processes than I want to be reminded about. I've done a lot of dancing in my life. I'm not sure it really improved the performance of the organization. All right, so much for wise people. Imagine an organization that 100 years ago invented a fantastic machine, state of the art and key for the success of this organization. 50 years ago, this machine started to make some trouble. And today, this machine is completely broken. It looked like this. This is not a true story, because in reality, people would have done something 50 years ago, right? Either try to fix this machine, or even better, try to invent a new machine. Because innovation is something we all love, right? Innovation is great, wonderful. We all want to be leading edge, unique, right on the forefront, better than everybody else. But that enthusiasm for innovation seems to be limited to technology innovation, right, into product services. But there is also something called management innovation that we should talk about today. And that's about exploring, embracing new ways of leading and managing. And management innovation, that doesn't seem to be great. That is scary. Kicking out the budget, are you crazy? Losing control, are you crazy? The consequence is that it's very crowded on the left-hand side. Everybody is into that kind of innovation in some form or shape. Management innovation, on the other hand, is not yet a crowded place because it is, or at least seems scary. But this is actually good news for brave companies who dare, again, to explore, embrace also this kind of innovation, because you can get just as much competitive advantage, performance out of management innovation as you can get from technology innovation. And there are companies out there who openly say that we have no advantage whatsoever in what we produce, what we sell, what we provide. We find it in the way we lead and manage. And I've got a few examples for you in a minute. So it's all about performance. That is why we should go beyond budgeting, because this is good for performance defined in the right way. So I will come back to that important word in a minute. But before that, it is still called beyond budgeting. It has something to do with budgets and budget problems. So I'd like to share with you my budget problem list. And please note that when I'm talking about budgets here, I'm talking about more than project budgets. We are talking about profit and loss budgets, cash flow budgets, balance sheet budgets, the whole broad definition of it. And my budget problem list is a long one. It's a very time-consuming process, making budgets, following up budgets. Some people think this is the biggest problem. I disagree, but the problem does belong on the list. Assumptions quickly outdated. I mean, we know all about that these days. I mean, companies having made a budget for 2023, it must be like kind of looking into a dark hole. I mean, who on earth knows how 2023 will develop? This is a serious problem. Budgeting can stimulate what I would call unethical behaviors. The lowballing, the gaming, the sandbagging, the frenzied December spending, these are not the kind of behaviors we would like to see between colleagues, right? So at the same time, I'm not blaming people for behaving like this, right? Because they are just responding to the system we have designed for them to operate within. So if we want to change behaviors, it's not about fixing people, it is about fixing systems. Budgets can create these illusions of control that we briefly touched upon. Of course, it might feel very comfortable to have next year described with 1 million details and decimals, but I mean, again, the only thing we know is that we don't know. So if we don't have control, whatever that word means, it's probably better to acknowledge that we don't have control and act accordingly than to think that we have control and act accordingly, even if that might feel a bit more scary and painful. Budgets force us to make decisions too early. We have to decide in the fall, the year before, what we shall do next year and what it shall cost. And in big corporations, too often, too many of these decisions are taken too high up. That doesn't always improve the quality of decisions. Very often, it is the other way around. Budgets can prevent us from doing stuff that we should have done, but we can't because it's not in the budget. But this also works the other way around, right? Sometimes it can lead us maybe to do things that we shouldn't have done, but it is in the budget and it is spend it or lose it. You know the game. And linked to this, I fully accept that the cost budget can be a very effective ceiling for cost, but let's not forget that it is just as effective as a floor in the sense that these budgets tend to be spent for the reasons we just discussed. And to define good performance as hitting your budget numbers is a very narrow, a very mechanical, and sometimes quite an outdated way of defining what is good performance. We need a richer, broader, more intelligent way of answering that important question: what is good performance? I have been sharing this list of problems with so many people all over the world, hundreds of thousands of people in the 25, 30 years I've been working with Beyond Budgeting. And most people out there, they agree. Executives, finance people, HR people, others. At the same time, most organizations continue doing this stuff, which is quite interesting. And I have a theory for you about why. But before that, let me add on one more problem that not too many have on the list. I've called it conflict in purposes, and I'll come back to that problem. It's an interesting problem because it's both a problem, but it also represents a solution to many of the other problems on this list. But again, how come so many continue doing stuff they agree isn't very smart? One reason could be that these problems are regarded more as irritating itches and not symptoms of a bigger, deeper, more systemic problem. But that is exactly what these problems are, symptoms of a huge problem, which is also a paradox. And the paradox is that here we are looking at the management process that is pretty old management technology. In case you don't know, it's around 100 years old, and the inventor was Mr. James O. McKinsey, the founder of McKinsey Consulting. I never met Mr. McKinsey, but I don't think he was an evil man. I think he had the best of intentions, right? He wanted to help organizations perform better. And I'm sure it worked 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago. But today, this way of thinking, this way of leading, this way of managing is doing exactly the opposite. It has become more of a problem than a support for getting our great performance in organizations. And that, my friends, I would call a pretty big problem. So we are back to this important word, performance. And I'd like to reflect on that word now for a few minutes in a slightly different setting than business and organizations. Because some of you know that I like to use traffic as a metaphor here. Because in traffic, when we are out driving, we would also like to experience good performance, a safe and good flow, especially when there is crossing traffic. And this is something we often meet, put up by traffic authorities to make that happen. And this slide, by the way, has no sensors, okay? And that means that the one who's in control here is the one who programmed this light. And where would that person be as you sit there waiting for that green light? Well, somewhere else. I never checked, but I don't think there was anybody sitting inside that pole. And the information that this programming would be based on would not be entirely fresh information as you sit there waiting, for obvious reasons. Fortunately, there is a very different solution with exactly the same purpose. We are talking about the roundabout. Here, very different answers to the same questions, because here we as drivers are in control. We make decisions based on fresh, real-time, here and now information. So very different answers. It could be interesting to compare these two ways of managing. So let's do that. And I've got a few leading questions for you here. It's actually proven scientifically that the roundabout is not just more efficient, it's actually also safer, and lifetime cycle cost is also lower. But at the same time, we know that the roundabout takes more competence from us. It is more difficult to drive in than to relate to a traffic light. And going back to our organizations, everything that we need to leave behind of traditional management practices are in many ways easier for everybody involved, including budgeting. But we can't go for what's easy because it's easy. We have to go for what is best for performance, even it does take more from us. So this stuff is not necessarily easier, but it is so much better. But it's not enough with fresh information here and the authority to act on it, because if there is a value set, a mindset among drivers waiting for that green light, which is about me first, I don't care about the rest, that mindset is normally not a big problem in front of that light, overruled, hopefully, by red. But in the roundabout, me first, don't care about the rest, can actually be a big problem, because here we are much more dependent on everybody involved sharing a common positive wish or purpose of wanting this to flow well. Here we have to help each other. We have to interact with each other in a very different way than what we need to do in front of that light. Two important words here. Trust is obviously one. In front of that light, we are not trusted to make decisions. In the roundabout, we are. Transparency is also important here. That is not important in front of that light. As long as we can see the color, we can make our decision. But in the roundabout, we need to be able to see and understand the entire situation in order to make our decision. I'm quite sensitive to language and labels in the stuff that we are talking about here when it comes to management and leadership. And there are some labels I really dislike. And one of those is performance management. I don't like it because I find it quite negative. What we basically are saying is that if we don't manage, if we don't manage your performance, there will be no performance. And also, I think there's quite some illusions into this. I think our ability to manage performance in today's business and people realities is somewhat limited compared to what we often like to think as executives or finance people or HR people. But performance management is a label that fits nicely if we talk about the traffic light, because that is exactly what traffic authorities are doing. They are managing performance very actively. In the roundabout, it is about something else. Here, it is more about creating conditions for great performance to take place. It is about enabling performance and not managing performance. And this, my friends, this is more than playing with words. These are two fundamentally different ways of addressing that important question. How do we get the best possible performance in our organization? That question is not new. That question has been with us always. It is the answers that have changed. Let's leave traffic. The roundabout is a more self-regulating way of managing, and self-regulation is another important word, because today organizations need more self-regulating management for at least two reasons. One reason is our business environment, with all the volatility and the uncertainty, the complexity and the ambiguity out there. And that level of VUCA is quite different today compared to when I started my budget and planning career many years ago. And that must have consequences for how we design our management models compared to if there is little or no VUCA out there. That should be quite obvious. The other reality we need to reflect on, it's not external, it's internal, it has to do with people, with employees. Asking ourselves what kind of employees do we generally think that we have in our organization? And I guess you're all familiar with Douglas McGregor and his theory X and theory Y, these two opposing views on people and what motivates people, where, as you know, theory X, this view that most employees are a bunch of potential thieves and crooks. Unless we manage them tightly and keep them on short leashes, they will all run away and do a lot of stupid things and spend money like drunken sailors. Well, McGregor, he was a bit more polite, but I think that's what he meant. Then you have theory Y, this much more positive view on people, a view that most people actually want to perform. They want to do a good job. They want to be involved. They want to be listened to. They want to be treated as adults. And we don't need so far to agree on where our sympathy lies, X or Y, even if I have a certain hope. But it should be very easy to agree that if we mainly believe in X, our management model should look very different compared to if we mainly believe in Y. If we then combine these two dimensions, it could look like this. And traditional management lies in this lower left-hand corner with a conscious or unconscious assumption that the world is still a predictable and plannable place, and that most people is on the X side. If we disagree with this, then this is not the place to be. Then we need to move up in that upper right-hand corner by addressing both leadership horizontally and our management processes vertically. And what we need to get out of traditional management is something that's very rigid, detailed, annual. There's a lot of rules-based micromanagement, centralized command and control, and a strong belief in secrecy and sticks and carrots as ways to drive performance. Well, maybe there was a time when this worked and this was the right thing to do, but that is a long time ago. And as we discussed, things have changed. So we need to move. On the leadership side, we need to be more purpose-based, more values-based, and less rules-based. There has to be more autonomy. In this VUCA world, there isn't always time to run 9 floors up to get that decision, because then it can be too late. And with these people on board, very often they can make good decisions for themselves. Transparency, here comes that important word again. And in this context, it's actually good news for managers afraid of losing control. And the good news is that transparency can be quite an effective control mechanism, a social control mechanism. And let me give you a quick example. There's a huge European pharmaceutical company called Roche, who today is on a beyond budgeting journey, by the way. A few years ago, they did a very interesting experiment around travel cost. In a pilot, they kicked out the travel budget, kicked out travel rules and regulations, and they replaced it with full transparency. So with a few examples, everybody could see everything. If you traveled, to where did you fly, eat, sleep, cheap or expensive, open for your colleagues to see, and vice versa. And guess what happened with travel cost in that pilot? Came down through a very simple self-regulating control mechanism, transparency. Last but not least, internal or intrinsic motivation as opposed to external or extrinsic motivation. And as you know, the most common extrinsic motivation mechanism in business today is individual bonus. And I can hardly think of any area where there's a bigger gap between what most research is telling us about motivation and what most businesses are practicing around individual bonus. I have to say it's simply pathetic and sad. So the beyond budgeting recommendation is to go for common bonus schemes instead of individual bonus schemes for many, many reasons, including what research is telling us. A number of organizations have the best intentions when it comes to people and leadership. They say the right things, they write the right things, but it doesn't help to have these theory Y leadership visions if you have theory X management processes, which is the case in a lot of companies. And if we are serious about these words, we need to change our management processes so that they better reflect our leadership intentions, while at the same time we are making our management processes more VUCA-focused. And what does this mean in practice? Well, a few other headlines. First of all, the traditional detailed budgets, they have to simply go, because they represent so much of what we find in that lower left-hand corner. More specifically, when we shall set targets and goals, then we can maybe find some inspiration in soccer. I have yet to meet a soccer team who claim that the ambition for next season is to score 39 goals and get 42 points. Those are budget goals, and they don't think like that. For them, it's all about doing well and hopefully outperform peers, other teams. When it comes to the rhythm of these processes, why on earth shall everything circulate around the fiscal year of January to December? From a pure business point of view, this is very often a completely artificial construct. So we need to organize where it makes sense, where it's possible, these processes on a more of a business and event-driven rhythm and less on a calendar-driven rhythm. And last but not least, when we shall evaluate performance, we cannot reduce that to comparing two numbers and then conclude. We need a richer, broader, more intelligent performance language. And this, my friends, was a very high-level introduction to what Beyond Budgeting is about, addressing both leadership and management processes in order to become more adaptive and more human. A number of organizations are today on this journey in some form or shape, and here are some of them. And I could have talked for hours and hours about amazing management innovation taking place here. We don't have the time. So I'm going to limit myself to one company here, but it's also a special company. I'm talking about the bank. You find a company at in the middle here at the top. It's a Swedish bank called Handelsbanken, around 500 branches in Northern Europe, quite big in the UK. And this is an amazing bank for many reasons. First of all, they operate without budgets, without targets, without individual bonus. Second, they have been doing so since 1970. And third, they have shown an amazing performance in all these years. This bank has been performing better than the average of its competitors every single year since 1972. And it's not a coincidence that this bank has never needed any bailout from the authorities because they messed it up. The CEO that kicked this off back in 1970 was Mr. Jan Wallander. And here is what he had to say about the budget. In the best case, totally unnecessary, and in the worst case, actively harmful. And I would argue more often actively harmful than totally unnecessary. A very, very fascinating story. And Handelsbanken and some other banks inspired what became known as Beyond Budgeting in the late 90s. The Beyond Budgeting principles were formulated a few years before the Agile manifesto, but as you will see now in a minute, there are many similarities between that manifesto and the Beyond Budgeting principles. And the principles, they look like this. And please note the tagline, performance the right way. Beyond Budgeting changes how we define performance and how we deliver performance. And again, the principles address both leadership and management processes, as hinted at earlier. And if you look at the leadership principles, I mean, they are not necessarily unique compared to what is recommended by other communities and models, including Agile. But very often, many of these communities have not reflected very much on what kind of management processes are needed to activate these leadership intentions. And this is a strong focus in Beyond Budgeting, creating coherence between what is said on the left-hand side, what is done on the right-hand side, because it has to hang together. There has to be coherence. There are also two other types of coherence that we focus on in Beyond Budgeting. Beyond the horizontal coherence I just mentioned, we're also talking about the vertical coherence, especially on the management processes. Those management processes start out in finance territory, targets, forecast, resource allocation, continue into HR territory, and it has to hang together. There has to be a coherent, consistent philosophy all the way through, coherence. And the last coherence we are talking about is the external one. Then you might have heard of Ashby's law, his study into biological systems, where a simple message was that if the viability, adaptability of a living organism is less than the kind of VUCA level of its environment, the organism will die. And the same goes for organizations. So coherence here is key. We have recently built on these 12 principles to develop something quite interesting. You are probably familiar with the business model canvas, Alex Osterwalder. That is a model for describing business models, but we have so far not had anything equivalent when it comes to management models, but now we have one built on these principles. And it actually looked like this. It is a map that you can use to discuss what is a management model. You can use it to describe what is your current model. You can use it to diagnose issues, and you can use it to design a better way. And the first thing you do here is to reflect on where is your external business environment on the top, and what's your belief on people on the bottom. And then you can map your management processes, as you see in the middle here, along the 12 principles. And again, there has to be coherence. Here's an example of not having coherence. A lot of theory Y, leadership intentions, and too many theory X management processes. We are not saying that it's necessarily always best to be at the right-hand side. Sometimes if your business environment is on the left and you believe, and that's where your people are as well, well then it could be coherence being on the left-hand side here, but then you would have some other problems. But again, there is a book coming out, the Viable Work Map, which will be out in a couple of months, which we think will help companies to get started. I know that many wonder, does this stuff work? Is it good for performance? Well, it's hard to prove mathematically, scientifically, but there are some strong indications emerging, even among the big consulting companies. This is Boston Consulting Group asking clients who operate without budgeting, what kind of benefits are they seeing? And I think these are quite impressive numbers, quite impressive positive effects coming out of beyond budgeting in straight financial terms and indirect organizational effects, which in the end will have positive financial effects. Another big consulting company, Bain & Company, they looked at what they call leading companies when it comes to financial planning, and looked at how these companies, how likely it is that these are using beyond budgeting principles, all or some of them, compared to not leading companies. And again, quite a compelling picture. Of course, this is not science. We should read this with a bit of caution, but they do give some pretty good indications. I also know that some people find the 12 beyond budgeting principles a bit scary, a bit overwhelming, and especially finance people and even some executives. If that is the case, here is some good news. We have a simple, practical, tested way of getting started, which goes back to that final problem on my budget problem list, conflicting purposes. And it has to do with a simple question: why do we budget? And again, think of budgets in the broad definition. And when I ask people this question, I typically end up with 3 different reasons. Companies make budgets to set targets, financial targets, sales targets, and so on, profit targets. At the same time, this budget shall be a kind of forecast of what next year look like in terms of cash flow, profit and loss. And third, the budget is a resource allocation mechanism, handing out bags of money to the organization on costs and investments. And it might seem very efficient to solve all 3 in one process and one set of numbers. But that is also the problem. And let me explain why. Let's assume that we are moving into a budget process, and upstairs, finance wants to understand next year's profit, hopefully. So they ask people responsible on the revenue side, what's your best numbers for next year? But everybody knows that what I'm sending upstairs will come back to me as a sales target for next year, maybe with a bonus attached to it. And that insight, that might do something with the level of numbers submitted. And I think you all know which way they will go. Moving to the cost side, when the same people, other people are asked, what's your best numbers for next year? Then everybody knows that this is my only shot at getting access to resources for next year. And maybe someone also remembers that 20% cut from last year. And that memory and that insight might also do something to the level of numbers submitted. And this is a problem, not just because it destroys the quality of numbers, but also because it stimulates this at least borderline unethical behaviors. That's the bad news. The good news is that there is a simple solution. We can still do these three things, but we should do them in three separate processes because these are different things. A target is an aspiration, it's what we want to happen, while a forecast is an expectation, what we think will happen, whether we like what we see or not, brutally honest. And resource allocation is about what it takes to make it happen. It's about optimizing what is often scarce resources. And because we have separated, then we can start to improve each one in ways impossible when it was all bundled in one process and one set of numbers. Now we can start to design targets that really inspire and stretch people without feeling stretched, and targets which are more VUCA robust. And some companies continue, as I will touch upon in a minute, to actually skipping target setting. We can start to work on the forecasting process, which is an expectation. We can work on getting the politics out of the forecast so that we can know we can trust the numbers. We don't need a million details. This is forecasting. And last but not least, we can find more intelligent, effective ways of managing cost than what Mr. McKinsey offered us 100 years ago. And here are some headlines. I'll give you some more meat on the bone on this in a minute. And last but not least, we can now organize each of these on more event-driven and less calendar-driven rhythms. And this is an important slide because when people tell me it's impossible to operate without a budget, my response is that, well, here we still do what that budget tried to do for us. But because we have separated, we can do each one in much better ways. And also, when we have these improvement discussions, this is a kind of non-scary backdoor into bigger beyond budgeting discussions. Target setting, what really motivates people, resource allocation, do we need detailed travel budgets if we say we trust people, and so on and so on. I mentioned that some companies continue to the target improvement with actually skipping targets, and a bit more about how they are thinking. And I think we need to remember that the target is not the target. What we really want is the best possible performance given the circumstances. And setting targets is just one way of achieving this and not always the best one. And I think we need to remember that when we are setting an annual target, we are actually sitting in the fall and trying to describe what does good performance look like 12 months down the road. And that can be quite difficult if there's a lot of fog and uncertainty. But we have to conclude, should it be 28, 30, 32, we end up with 29.2, and that becomes the answer that everything shall be measured against and performance evaluated against. But if performance evaluation is a key reason for setting targets, then when do we know best what is good performance? Would that be before or after? And that, my friends, was a leading question. Nice drawings, Paul, but if you could skip that, please. At least they are showing up on my screen. Thank you. So,
Bjarte, 1 second, folks. Out of respect, this is uncalled for. Please do not do this. This is quite embarrassing. Please do not scratch on the screen.
Okay, thanks.
Right, apologies, please go on.
So, no problem. So, we should also remember Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, right? And the reason is that the purpose shifts from control from learning to control. But I'm not saying that you should skip targets, but if you shall have targets, beyond budgeting recommends where it's possible to set relative targets. And that is what Equinor has been doing for 15 years. These are the two main financial targets that the company operates within. And these two metrics, they have the issues, but the point is that the company is thinking in relative terms. The target here is to perform better than average on both metrics every year. And the message here is not how Equinor is performing, which is actually quite well. The message is how does the company define performance. These two metrics, by the way, drive the common bonus scheme in the company. How is the company doing versus competition? I don't have time to say more about targets. I'm going to use a few minutes now on resource allocation, which people have the most questions about. How do you manage cost without budgets? And another metaphor to give you an idea about how we are thinking in beyond budgeting. Imagine an organization that requires fuel in order to produce and operate. And what would be the best way for this company to be supplied with fuel? Would that be to receive a fixed number of fuel cans delivered once a year, 1st of January? Or would it be access to fuel through a pipeline where how much you consume is regulated by how much you produce? And that, my friends, that was meant to be a leading question. Of course, the latter solution is much better. Whatever mechanisms we are applying here, it is very important that we are building what we call a cost-conscious mindset, which is very much about asking different questions than what you hear in the budget world, because that question is typically, what, do I have a budget for this when you shall do something? And if you have, it's okay. If you don't have, it's not okay, a bit simplified. We need to hear other questions. Is this really necessary? What's good enough? How much value is this creating? And is this within my execution framework? And as you will see in a minute, this is not an anarchy. Beyond budgeting is trying to make the room to move in bigger, but there are still walls in this room. There are still guardrails. And these are questions we should ask all the time for every dollar we spend, and not just in November and December when the budget bag is almost empty. This mindset is, for some organizations, sufficient, combined with transparency. For many others, they need something more. And here's an example of tools that can be used for managing operating cost. And it is a menu of different options where we want to leave the traditional budget behind and move towards something with more autonomy. And here is one option. A burn rate guiding. There's still a number in the range of 1,000, 1 million, 10 million, but within that, you can do exactly the right thing. No micromanagement. Big difference between these two alternatives. But sometimes it can be difficult to know, should it be 1,000, 800, 1,200? Then we can move from an absolute thinking to a relative thinking, and think in terms of unit cost. Right, US dollar per customer, per employee, whatever, you can spend more input, okay, if there's more output. We can make it even more relative and say it's not about kind of any unit cost targets or constraints. It's about unit cost being competitive versus peers. Or even more relative, if there are internal units with a that fully control own income and cost. If this unit has a tough bottom line target, then that's also a way of managing costs. They cannot run away or spend money like crazy, but it might be okay to spend more if what they spend is what we should call good cost, because good cost create value. It's the bad cost we need to get rid of. And the last alternative here is nothing at all. No budget, no target, no nothing. The only numbers here are actual cost numbers, which are monitored, looking at trends, through control charts or moving averages. And if it looks okay, we do nothing. If it looks a bit strange, we investigate. And if there is a strange trend, we of course we check it up. It might be perfectly okay, a good doses of good cost, but we might also come across teams, managers who consciously abuse the trust that lies in this model. And the only thing you know if you show trust is that somebody will abuse it, right? So that's not the issue. The issue is how we respond. And then we need to think clothing hangers again, because the wrong response is to punish everybody because somebody abused that trust. The right response is to continue trusting, but deal firmly with those who abused it and let it have the necessary consequences. Right? This is not about being soft and evasive. It's about not putting everybody in jail because somebody did something wrong. And the further to the right we are here, the stronger we need to be on values, the stronger we need to be on direction. And in addition to these mechanisms, there should be guardrails linked to, for instance, decision authorities. How big dollar decisions can you make before you have to go one level up? And spending guidelines. I mean, like when is it okay to fly economy and when is it okay to fly business? Has nothing to do with travel budgets. It's just making it a bit easier for people to make. Right. So that was actually my last slide. These are my contact details. If you want to, for instance, check me out later on Twitter and LinkedIn. This is my website, and check also out the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable website. It is being revamped these days, so it's a bit outdated, but still. And what you just heard was the very short version of this stuff. This is the long version, a book I've written about my own journey and beyond budgeting, more of everything, including what we did in a company called Borealis in the mid-90s, before there was anything called beyond budgeting. There was a chapter about beyond budgeting in Agile, and also more about implementation advice. And a little bit later this month, then this book is out. This is Beyond Budgeting. It's a shorter book with having executives as a target group, which kind of condenses some key messages from the previous book, but also includes a lot of new learnings from my side since that previous book came out back in 2016. So with those words, I'd like to stop sharing, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Bjarte, thank you very much. And by the way, I apologize if you have noticed some of the scratching and background noise.
It's okay,
that
don't
people
worry.
have produced. You know, we can't control
No,
outliers.
that's okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Folks, any questions, any comments to Bjarte's presentation?
Looks like there's one in the chat there.
Yep. There was one legit one from Anja Warich. Bjarte, I can read it off to you.
I see that, yeah. Is there any research available
Yep.
on the cost of budgeting? Yes, actually, Gary Hamel, Michele Zanini, they have a Harvard Business Review article on the cost of bureaucracy, including budgeting in the US. And that is simply scary reading. I think they talk about 3 trillion US dollars. I don't know how many zeros that are, but it's a very thorough article backing this up, that there are significant costs related to traditional management. So check out that article.
Yeah, thanks. I know it.
Okay.
It's 3 trillions per year.
Right. It's amazing.
Dollars,
Yeah.
just the US.
Yeah.
That's bureaucracy cost. Right.
Yes. Amazing.
Yeah, I knew that one. Great, thanks.
Yeah. So, are any of the companies implementing BB listed on the stock market? Yes, the majority, including Equinor, which I worked for, listed in New York and in Oslo in Norway. And we often get that question. I mean, how does this, what are the market and the investor saying? Well, the truth is the market is not interested in budgets. They are interested in performance, right? So, and in communicating with the market, it can be very useful to have an unpolluted, unbiased forecast as a basis for that dialogue with the market. You get that with beyond budgeting because the quality of forecasting is increasing so much.
Thank you very much for your answer.
You're welcome.
Folks, please throw another question or two at Bjarte. I know we're at the end of the hour, but perhaps we can ask another question just to be cognizant of everyone's time, and go ahead.
Can I ask another one?
If no one else goes, yes, please go, Anja.
Thank you. Do you have any thoughts on the beyond budgeting in public administration?
Yes, I actually have a chapter about that in my new book. And with a spoiler alert, beyond budgeting can work in the public sector. And it's just as much needed in the public sector as in the private. And we actually have a huge public sector social services organization in Norway that have operated without cost budgets now for 3 years with amazing results. So the answer is short. The answer is yes. Read more about it in my book.
Great, thank you.
We also have a number of non-NGOs working without budgets and following the beyond budgeting principles. You might be familiar with Human Rights Watch, based in New York. One example.
Great, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you for the question.
All right, if that's it, could I just say one thing at the end here?
Please, Bjarte. Yeah.
What you've heard today and what we have been talking about, it will happen. I don't care if it's called beyond budgeting or business agility. I mean, that is not important, but it will happen. And I'm convinced that in 10, 15, maybe 20 years time, when we look back at what was traditional or mainstream management in 2023, I think we will smile, even have a laugh, just like we today smile about the days before the internet or before the smartphone. And how long ago is that, right? And organizations have a choice. They can be early movers and get the competitive advantage out of this, or they can be dragged into this as one of the last ones, or anything in between. And every day you wait, competitors will be ahead of you. And maybe even you have a choice. Maybe some of you can be among those who made this happen in your organization and will be remembered for making this happen in your organization. So think about your legacy, and you will not regret this if you give this a go. Very few companies go back because this stuff works. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bjarte. Thank you very much for coming out and doing this. Thank you, everyone who joined and participated and watched. As I mentioned, this will be posted, the presentation itself, the recording and the materials will be posted shortly, and everyone should have it available at their disposal. Please do share it with other colleagues. And once again, Bjarte is freely available on LinkedIn and through other channels. So if you would like to reach out to him directly for his assets, please do so. Once again, thank you very much. Happy New Year. And let's keep going and do more great events together. Cheers.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you very much.